Today's Torah, this week's Torah portion is Re'eh. We are in Deuteronomy, of course, and it begins at the end of chapter 11. And I'd like to focus on the beginning of chapter 12. One of the things that characterizes this Torah portion is that it introduces us to the first time to the idea of a central temple in a central place in the land of Israel. What we do have is a mention of this central place of worship where God will place his name, and we'll shortly read some of those verses. What we don't have is the name Jerusalem, okay? Throughout this Torah portion, a number of times, God talks about this special place, but he doesn't say where it is. And of course, we know it's only in King David's time that that is revealed exactly where that place will be. The Temple Mount, and it is actually David who buys the Temple Mount from a Jebusite. And although he is dying to build the temple himself, God tells him, no, this is something that only your son Solomon will do. But David does what he can to make the preparations and to have that land available, and then the temple will be built by Solomon. But here, where we first learn about this idea of a temple, there is no name of where it will be. Now, interestingly enough, the Samaritans, they are people that their origin is actually quite interesting. We have a hint of their origin in 2 Kings, beginning in chapter 17, where as a result of the destruction of the northern kingdom and the exile of most of the people from the northern kingdom to Assyria, there's a story there about first of all, we learn that this is the way the Assyrians handled things. Every place they conquered, they exiled the people. They basically shuffled everybody around. It was actually a very brilliant concept, because the idea was if you're in a place that is not your own, you don't feel comfortable enough to rebel. And so that's basically what they did, shuffled around people. And so they brought foreigners into the northern kingdom who were pagan initially. And then they go through a situation where they start worshiping the God of Israel, but at the same time they hold on to their pagan gods. And that is the story that's related to us in 2 Kings chapter 17. Interestingly enough, again, they're in the northern kingdom. They are not in Jerusalem. And later on in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, they are part of the troublemakers that disturb the Jews coming back from Babylon when they want to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And what we know now is that they had their own temple on Mount Gerizim. And they believe that this place, that they have the 5 books of Moses. They do not have the rest of the Bible. They have the 5 books of Moses, but there's certain differences in their version, okay? And one of the differences is here, where God says, the place that I will choose to place my name. In a Samaritan Bible, the words Mount Gerizim are inserted. So whereas in our Bible, it remains a mystery, in the Samaritan Bible, they wanted to be sure to sort of ground their position that it's Mount Gerizim, and they inserted those words, Mount Gerizim. So that's just an interesting tidbit. But basically, the important thing here is to realize that here we do not have the name of Jerusalem, and we don't know exactly where that will be. Okay, let's start by reading the first few verses in chapter 12. These are the laws and rules that you must carefully observe in the land that the Lord God of your fathers is giving you to possess as long as you live on earth. That's a very general statement. And then we go into something much more specific. You must destroy all the places at which the nations you are to dispossess worship their gods, whether on the high mountains or under any fresh tree. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, or I don't know if I would call it a pillar, their tablets or their I don't know, there's a better word for it, but I can't think of it right now. Put their sacred posts to the fire and cut down the images of their gods, obliterating their name from that site. Do not worship the Lord your God in like manner, but look only to the site that the Lord your God will choose amidst all your tribes as his habitation, to establish his name there. There you go, and there you are to bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes and contributions, your votive and freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and flocks. Together with your households, you shall feast there before the Lord your God, happy in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. Okay, so what we learn here is that when the focus of these few verses is, number one, to destroy pagan worship. Number two, and this begins in verse 4, do not worship the Lord in this way, okay? In other words, there's something about the description of the pagan worship that we see in verse 2 and 3 that the Bible is then distinguishing and saying when you worship God, it's going to be very different from the kind of worship that we read about in verse 2 and 3. And then we have one of the differences, that rather that choosing one place, there will be a place where God will choose to place his name. And here it says, there's here something that is not translated well. I'd like to retranslate 5, more literal and clearer, I believe. But to the place that the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes to place his name there, you shall seek out where he dwells and go there. And I think that's very, very important. You are to seek out where he dwells, because the word here is lishichno tidrashu, and you can either translate it as where he dwells or where his presence is. For those of you who know the Hebrew word shechina, it's from the same word. There you are to seek the place that God has chosen to place his name, and the place where he has chosen to have you feel his presence. Okay, that's basically what we're supposed to say. So how is that different? Okay, that's the continuation of do not do this to the Lord your God. How is this idea of worshiping in one place where God has chosen to place his name, how is that a contrast to the kind of pagan worship we have described in verses 2 and 3? So first of all, if I kind of put this all together and I look at the words and try to focus on what they mean and what they're telling us. So first of all, we have in verse 2 this idea of worshiping God under every tree. And this gives you a sense, of course, where are there trees? There are trees everywhere. So this idea of worshiping under every tree, it's kind of like saying every single place every single place the pagans will worship. Now, we who believe in one God, we believe that God is everywhere. So we don't have a problem, I would think, we don't have a problem with this idea that no matter where I am, I can worship God. So what exactly is the problem here? Why is, on the one hand, pagan worship is that they worship under every tree? Why is that problematic? And I think that I think you have to get into the head of a pagan in order to understand what is the issue here. Pagan worship is very place-oriented. But it's place-oriented in the sense that it's the exact opposite of worshiping one God. When we worship the one God, creator of the universe, we believe that that one God is in charge of the whole universe, and there is no place in the universe that he is not present, that we cannot feel his presence, or that he is not in charge. However, when it comes to pagan worship, a pagan God will have a territory. And if you are praying to a particular God in a particular place, usually you are indicating that he is sovereign only in that place. Now, that place can be wider than a particular temple. Like, for example, they may have had a pagan temple in a particular city, but that pagan god would be considered to be in charge of that whole region. But the temple is in the center of that region, okay? But I think here when they're talking about under every tree, it also reminds us not just that they're praying to many, many gods. It's a multi-theism kind of idea. They're praying to many gods with temples all over the place, and each god has its own jurisdiction and its own territory. And also it helps us remember under every tree, very often the tree itself became the God. Okay, we know in other places that there are holiness. The Asherah, for example, which is mentioned here, the Asherah, it's sacred. Asherah is translated here as sacred posts, but actually an Asherah is a holy tree. Okay, it's the tree itself that represents something, and it becomes a god. The tree itself becomes a god. So this is something I think that clearly the monotheism and believing in the one God of Israel is fighting against. We also see in verse 2, on the high places, on the high hills, and on the mountains. Okay, now there is a concept that we see particularly in the Book of Kings. In Hebrew, it's called bamot, and that is often translated as high places. And very often, the prophets are railing against the nation of Israel, who rather than coming to the one place, the one temple to worship, they are building altars in high places. They're called the bamot. They're building these altars. And of course, one of the problems here, most cases when, especially in the kingdom of Judea, when they're talking about the worships of the high places, they are talking about worshiping the God of Israel. They are not talking about pagan worship, but they are talking about worshiping the God of Israel in a decentralized fashion on all these different high places all over the country. Now, it's here I want to make it very clear that we're talking about two different things. This is not about prayer. When we think today about a temple or a church or any kind of house of worship, we immediately associate that with prayer. In biblical times, you could pray wherever you wanted. And prayer was actually not an organized thing. Prayer was very personal for the most part, okay? It was the sacrifices that were considered a special ceremony or special type of worship that was dictated, and it was that needed to be in one central place, not all over the place. It's interesting, though, and I heard once a teacher talk about this, and I think it gave a lot of perspective. There were no synagogues, okay? As I said, prayer was an individual thing. You could pray wherever you wanted, in your house, in your garden, as you're tilling the fields. You could always talk to God. God was available to anybody to talk to him. But in the ancient world, it was hard for people to be satisfied with just prayer. They wanted something more. They wanted a ceremony. They wanted action. And sacrifices gave them that. But here God was very specific. You're talking about sacrifices? I don't want altars all over the place. You want to seek me and talk to me wherever you want? Fine. Altars? Not all over the place. And so already here, when we talk about high places, we have two issues that are being hinted at. Number one, this idea that we know will be very popular later on, worshiping God in all kinds of high places. But it is an influence from pagan worship, because in pagan worship, it wasn't just that you are worshiping in high places, but the high places themselves become a godlike thing. They worship the mountains. They worship the temple. They worship whatever it is they built on the high places. It doesn't become a vehicle to worship one God. It becomes a vehicle to worship a whole variety, a whole pantheon of gods. And this, of course, is something that we're going to contrast with the temple. But there's also something else going on in high places. There is a verse in Psalm 126, verse 2. Psalm 125. Psalm 125, which is a psalm that talks about Jerusalem. And I have to find it. Okay, here it is. It talks about God, it talks about Jerusalem. And in this context, verse 2, it says as follows: Jerusalem hills surrounded, and the Lord surrounds his people now and forever. Okay, it's a beautiful image, and the idea here is to compare in the same way that Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains, so too the nation of Israel is surrounded by God. Now, first of all, I think this idea of God surrounding the nation is very similar to what we were talking about before. When you believe in the one God of Israel, you believe that he is everywhere. He surrounds you. He's not focused. Okay. Those who worshiped a God on a high place believed that he had to focus there on the one mountain because that's where God was. Here, even though there's going to be a temple, and we're going to get to that in a second, but is that where God is? That's not where God is. Okay. That's where God has given us the ability to focus our prayers and our worship of him. But God is everywhere. And this is what the Psalm tells us. In the same way that Jerusalem is surrounded by hills, God surrounds us. He's everywhere. We're in one place, but God surrounds us. Okay. But what does this also tell you? Mountains surround Jerusalem. Okay. Now here we're talking about the original old city of Jerusalem. And I would argue probably the focus of this is the Temple Mount. Okay. Now, mountains surround us. Now, any of you who have ever been to the Western Wall, for example, you look around you, you see the mountains surrounding Jerusalem, you realize that the site of the temple is lower than the surrounding mountains. Jerusalem might be on a mountain, but it's much lower than the other mountains around it. Mount of Olives, you can see across, is much higher than the area of the old city of Jerusalem, and particularly of the Temple Mount. And, you know, there's a beautiful idea here that I think is something, we have this idea in Judaism in general. There's a midrash that talks about Mount Sinai. Why is it that God chose Mount Sinai to bring his revelation to the nation? And there's a little story there. It's like a story that brings a message, where there were all these different mountains, big, powerful, high mountains, that went to God and said, we want to be the mountain where you're going to reveal yourself to the nation. We're big, we're strong, we're high, you know, powerful, volcanic, whatever. And God in the end said, no, I'm going to choose Mount Sinai. It's a small little mountain, totally not spectacular in any way. In fact, today, nobody knows where Mount Sinai is. For that reason, it was just one mountain in the middle of the desert. And God is saying in this midrash, the lesson is that God is not seeking the grandiose. He is seeking the simple, the modest, okay? And I think this is part of what we're talking about here, the contrast between the place that God will choose, which is Jerusalem, the lower place, and the high places of the worship to the pagan gods. God is not looking for the high places. He is looking for the modest kind of place, the lower mountain. Okay, surrounded by other mountains, the lower mountain, more modest, more unassuming. Actually, very interesting, because if any of you have been to Shiloh, of course, is where the tabernacle stood and was there for almost 400 years. It was, in a sense, the first temple before there was a real temple. Okay, it was temporary in nature from the beginning. It was clear that Shiloh was not going to last forever. Although I don't know how much the people living in the time of Shiloh understood that it wasn't going to last forever. It wasn't this final place that God is referring to here in Deuteronomy 12. But if you've ever been to Shiloh, and if you go to where they believe the tabernacle stood, it too, like Jerusalem, is similar. It is on a hill, but it is much lower than all the surrounding hills. And you can say the same thing. Shiloh, mountains surround her. So this seems to be the kind of thing that God is looking for when he is choosing a place to place his name. Now let's take a look at verse 5 again. But to the place where the Lord your God will choose to place his name. Okay, so first of all, the name. God's name. What does God's name mean? What does anybody's name mean? Okay, now I think name, usually when you give a name to a person or name to a thing, you are trying to describe it or to identify it. And very often we have the name of God meaning somehow representing God himself. And we also have this idea that you will seek his presence. And I think what this introduces to us is what was probably the most difficult thing in monotheism as opposed to pagan religions. Pagan religions, one good thing about a pagan religion was that you could feel and see something tangible to represent or to believe in or to pray to. You know, it was a statue, it was a tree, it was a mountain, it was, I don't know, the sun and the moon. You know, there are all kinds of gods, but it was something very, very physical. When God took the nation out of Israel, and he gave them the 10 commandments. He said to them, there shall be no other gods upon me, upon my face. And You should not make pictures and not make graven images, okay? It is an anti-physical God. Not just God himself is not physical, but don't even try to represent God in something physical. That in and of, even if you say, well, I'm just making a picture. I know the picture's not God. I'm just making a statue. I know the statue's not God, but I need it as a representation of God. In fact, Maimonides said that he believes that the way people went from believing in the one God, Adam in the Garden of Eden, Noah, these were the founders of humanity. They all believed in one God. How did we even get to the pagan worship? And his theory is it began by people trying to just have some kind of tangible representation of God. And then somewhere along the way, they forgot that it was only a representation, and they started to worship the thing itself. And so here, God is saying, he's using two words to represent him: name and Shekhinah, presence, okay? Things which are by definition non-tangible. What's a name? What you know about God? What are his attributes? How does he speak? What does he command us to do? He's righteous. He's holy. That's his name, okay? In fact, one of the names that we say that we call God, we say, the Holy One, blessed be he. What's that? Is that his name? Yes, it's an attempt to describe his essence, okay? We cannot minimize God. We can only somehow describe him in these very ethereal, non-tangible ways. And I think by focusing on his presence and his name, that's another way that in these verses, God is separating himself from pagan concepts, okay? Now, at the end of the chapter, in verses 30 and 31, we are going to, again, look at in verse 31. We have, again, the same use of this word. You shall not act this way towards the Lord your God. In Hebrew, it's exactly the same words as in verse 4. Do not do this to voice your God, to the Lord your God. In chapter 30, we talk about, beware of being lured into their ways after being do not inquire about their gods, how did those nations worship their gods? I too will follow these practices. So again, we have on the one hand the influence to follow pagan worship and a very definitive statement, no, you can't do that. But here, in the continuation of this verse, we have a very specific type of pagan worship that God is saying you should not be doing, okay? For they perform for their gods every abhorrent act that the Lord detests. They even offer up their sons and daughters in fire to their gods. Okay? This is really bad. This is probably the worst in pagan worship. So if until now we talked about the problems in pagan worship being that it was multiple gods, that it was physical and tangible items, the danger of the connection with the trees and mountains to worship. Here we have a type of worship that the type of worship self is a terrible abomination. Murdering your own children in some way to please a god, what could be more disgusting than that? So then the question is, and I'm going to now go back to, I mentioned Maimonides before and his theory about how pagan worship began. He also has a very interesting theory on sacrifice, because what we have here, we do have a mention of sacrifice. It says in verse 6, there you will bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes and contributions, etc., etc. Okay, so what's interesting, of course, is that sacrifices is something that is used in both pagan and God worship. These high places and every tree and everything, what were they doing there? They were bringing animal sacrifices, and in addition to the child sacrifices, put that aside for a moment, but they were doing animal sacrifices. So on the one hand, we have a whole distinction between the kind of worship that we are supposed to do and the kind of worship that we are not supposed to do, which is the pagan worship. And yet when it comes to actual sacrifices, both of them are involved, both pagan and and Israelite worship uses sacrifices. Now here again, Maimonides brings in a wonderful, wonderful theory, which I really like. And what he said is this: as you can see from these verses and other verses we've encountered before, and we will continue to encounter, that you get a sense from the way Moses, especially in Deuteronomy, is warning the nation about the dangers of pagan worship, that it must have been an incredible influence. It must have been an incredible weakness, even an addiction. Okay, this was something that your average person was so immersed in that they would have found it very, very difficult to resist the temptation to go to pagan worship. And we can see all this time, he says, don't do this. This is what they do. You're going to encounter this in the land. Make sure you break up their altars. Don't be influenced by them. And you can see, I mean, today, if we're going to come into a pagan land and we're going to see altars and statues and people bowing down to them, we'll probably say, oh, that's interesting, and walk away. It will do absolutely nothing for us. There's no temptation there for us. But clearly, in those days, it was a tremendous temptation. And so what Maimonides says is that when God was setting up this whole new faith and teaching the true faith to the nation of Israel, there was only so much he was going to be able to cancel. And because humanity at that point was so connected to sacrifice as a means of worship, he was going to keep that means of worship the same. But his lesson would be, if you feel you can really express yourself in worshiping God through sacrifice, fine, we can keep the sacrifice. Of course, within rules and regulations and this and that, but instead of using the sacrifice to worship under every tree and every mountain, you can only worship the one God, and only in one place. And it's only in one place. It has an extra added value because it means all the nation is together in one place. And when the priests bring the offerings in one place, there's a sense of unity. They represent the entire nation. It's not just one God, it's one nation in one place. And so we have a lot of positive ideas coming through here in this idea of worshiping in one place. So here again, we can then better understand why sacrifices came to be, but how they were limited extensively once God introduces this idea of a temple and a monotheistic belief. Now, there are those who believe that we as Jews, as faithful Jews, believe that there will one day be a third temple. But there are many people, and I think I'm one of them, who is not so sure that it's the sacrifices themselves that will come back. Because perhaps we don't need those sacrifices anymore. There'll be one temple, but there will be a different type of worship. And perhaps prayer, which has become so much more centralized to us today, and our idea of gathering for worship with prayer together, not just every individual when they feel like it, but also coming together in unity to pray. This might be something that we are able to do today that our ancestors 2,000 and 3,000 years ago would have found it much more difficult to just pray and not have something tangible or some kind of activity that will come with it. And I just want to conclude with two verses from the prophets that, of course, are speaking towards the end of the first temple period, at a time when there was tremendous corruption in the temple. Jeremiah says in chapter 7, verse 4, he says as follows: do not put your trust in illusions or in lies. Illusions is not, in falsities, and say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these buildings. No, if you really mend your ways and your actions, if you execute justice between one man and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, if you do not shed blood of the innocent in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own hurt, then only will I let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers for all time. At the time of Jeremiah, the temple started to be seen not as this amazing place where God has put his presence. From there comes our inspiration and our understanding of following God's will. But the temple had become something almost pagan itself. It was the actual sacrifices in the place of the temple that the nation saw as some kind of magic amulet. They could do whatever they wanted. They could oppress the weak. They could do all kinds of sins. As long as they came to the temple and brought their sacrifices, abracadabra, and everything is fine. And this is very dangerous because it turns the temple into almost something pagan, as if it's like a magic formula. And so this is what Jeremiah says. No, it's not the temple. Don't think that, temple is it's not the temple, it's your actions. And if your actions are pleasing to God, then God will give you blessing on this land. And I think it's very important. The word here, it says, and God will let you dwell. Shikanti etchem. It's the very same root as what we have here in our Torah portion. You should seek the place where God dwells. If you truly seek the place that God dwells, and with the real intention, understanding what that place is, not as something pagan, but as a place to focus your attention so that you can better worship God together as a nation, then indeed, if you have that attitude looking for God's dwelling and where he dwells, then God indeed will let you dwell in the land. And then, of course, in Isaiah 56, verse 7, very famous. I will bring them to my sacred mountain, let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer of all people. And this is really reflects what I was saying before. He's still referring to it, a place for offerings and sacrifices. And again, in Isaiah's time, I can't believe that he would even have been able to envision some kind of a temple without sacrifices there. But notice that he calls this house not the place where God will place his name, but a place of prayer. Okay, and so this, I think, is really the essence of the temple in our minds today. A place of prayer, a place where everybody can come together to seek God's presence, to understand what he wants of us, and to join together and pray. And so this, and I think, understanding these subtle differences between the pagan kind of worship, which is so much more concrete and is so much more, and not to mention some of the abominations that it involves, but this very concreteness of it, it destroys the whole essence of what the temple is supposed to be. It's not the building, it's the focal point. It's a place where we feel God's presence, not because God is there, God is everywhere, but God has enabled us to have a focal point where we can feel his presence more and direct our prayers in a better way. That's it for today. You can put on your mics, and if anybody has anything to say, they'd love to hear it.
Sondra, what's that reference in Jeremiah? What chapter were you in?
Jeremiah 7.
Verse 4 to 7.
Verses 4 through 7 is what I was referring to.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Vanessa.
I too believe that God is everywhere. But after a sermon, I approached a rabbi who has since passed away, a brilliant, brilliant man. And I said, Rabbi, I thought that God was everywhere. And his answer was, is he in your yogurt? Well, I was dumbfounded and I couldn't react from there. It's like, well, right, he's not in my yogurt, but I didn't know how to answer that.
No.
Well, there is a philosophy that I think it's called Anthropomorphism.
Yes.
And it's actually a kind of pagan idea that God is in your yogurt, God is in the tree, God is everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's like, not God is everywhere in our sense, that there's this supernatural force that's around us, but that actually the tree has a piece of God. And it kind of moves you from believing one God is everywhere to one God is kind of very concrete in your yogurt. So,
Yes.
I don't think you meant that God was in your yogurt. I think you meant that you feel God wherever you are. And the fact is that God created the yogurt. Well, at least he created the cow that gave the milk. Set up the process, which brought you the yogurt. So no, when you're eating your yogurt, you're not eating God. And that's very important.
Well, I thought of that answer like 10 minutes away from and then, yes, thank you.
I don't know. That's a weird, I must say, that's a weird answer, but okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Do you
Anyone
know?
else have something they want to say?
Yes.
Okay. Yes,
do.
Diane.
Yes, I'm thinking that
both views about the future temple. That have some believe it's a place where you will that sacrificial worship will be reinstituted, and others who think it's not. That's going to be a house of prayer. I think very often in questions like this, the answer is not either or, it's both. That after the sacrificial worship is reinstituted, something is going to happen, and God will be worshipped after that whole system is kind of wrapped up and tied up. We'll move to a higher place in worship.
It's possible.
Where it will be, God's presence will be so profound and so recognizable that we will move to where the temple will be a place of prayer.
Well, I think that the temple will, in any case, be a place of prayer.
Well, yes, of course.
I mean, that's what Isaiah say. In other words, it will be a place of the sacrifices, but it's also a place of prayer. And the question is really, will there be sacrifices at all? And even if there will be sacrifices, like what you're suggesting is that, but the prayer will end up taking precedence and be much more focused. And it's certainly a possibility. You know, I just personally feel uncomfortable with the idea of sacrifice because it's so foreign to us. And I'm wondering if we can possibly connect to sacrifices. You know, can we find that meaningful for us? And I don't know. So my personal opinion is I'm not sure we're going to go that way, but I can't possibly say yes or no because who knows? When we get there, we'll know.
I've been doing the sacrifices for the last few years, like in different fields and places where the priests have been allowed to go.
But in Judaism, there's no sacrifices.
Well, they're doing it in Jerusalem. The priests are.
No, they're not.
They have
no sacrifices.
The
priests are not doing sacrifices. What they are doing, there's a temple institute that is creating all kinds of studying and preparing, and they've built vessels and the menorah and all these things, getting ready for the temple, but nobody's bringing sacrifices. It's considered to be a great big fat no.
They've had a lamb and different. I know. I don't think
the Samaritans believe that sacrifices are still relevant, and on Mount Gerizim to this day, they bring the Passover sacrifice every year.
That's what I'm talking about.
They're not Jewish.
Yeah,
that's
Samaritans.
That's a different group. Ruchama, what did you want to ask? Oh, you're on mute. You have to put off your mute.
Okay,
Good.
Now you can hear me? I want to say something about Vanessa's question. When God created the world, he created everything, and he put Adam there, and it's written, God finished his job, and now he put Adam le'ovda u'leshomra, to finish and to do. So everything in the future that people did, they had this from God. Even the innovations that the Jewish people are doing now in Israel, it's the mind and the intention is from God. That so this is also in everything that is done after it. God is there, actually, Vanessa, not in your yogurt, but it's but in whatever people arranged.
Right.
They have it in whatever God already gave them the ability to do it.
Yes,
Right.
definitely. And I still believe God is everywhere. I don't care.
He is. There was a song, I remember when my kids were little, there was a song, God is here, God is there, God is truly everywhere. And you would sing it with the kids.
Yeah. So
Right. All right. Anyway, good to see you all. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
See you again next week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Shalom.
Bye, Rachama.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.